since the resumption. So
I think Watford have been through quite a few managers, haven't they?
yeah. Oh, enormous list.
Yeah.
I support the Arsenal women's team, and they haven't been allowed to play at all. That's the end of their season.
Really? I didn't realise that.
Yeah, the women's game was just cancelled. The league.
That's a bit discriminatory, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's a different financial circumstances in the women's league, so
I see.
Well,
I think in the end they weren't too stressed about it. They thought it was a wise decision. I think generally that's the consensus.
but divisions 1 and 2 of the Football League were cancelled as well, weren't
Yes, yeah.
Actually, I'm hoping that it'll change the culture, and in fact we'll have part professional and part amateur teams in the lower leagues, and I think that might make it a much more local experience, part of the community.
Yes, that's what I like about the women's game. The women's game is at that stage. It feels like a local team.
Yeah. For instance, I would be supporting Harrow and Wealdstone or Harrow Town as the local community football team.
We're talking football, Julie.
How boring.
Julie? You'll be fascinated with football, I'm sure.
Tennis, yes, not football.
Yes, well, unfortunately, no tennis.
Well, they had a kind of British men's competition, which was quite good. There are some going on.
That's not going on still, though, is it?
No,
it's
finished
now, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so at least we get to see the best players in England.
Yeah, that's right.
Or in Great Britain.
Maybe some people would join in as we go along. Because I'm sharing the screen, I probably won't be able to see all of you. If you are politely raising your hand, if you want to ask a question or make a comment while I'm doing the talk, so just shout up and butt in, basically. Okay, shall we go?
Let's go.
Let's go. I'm just going to admit somebody wanting to come in now on an iPhone. Hello there. Is that Najibullah? Is that you, Naj? Can't hear. Okay. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Right. Renaissance humanism. Renaissance means rebirth, as perhaps you know. It's a French word. I don't know why, but I always assumed it was an Italian word. It is actually a French word, coined by a French art historian. Rebirth of what, you might ask? And by the way, if you can't hear clearly or you can't see the picture clearly, let me know before we get going properly. You all right?
Yep.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So rebirth of what? What is being reborn in the Renaissance? Well, as it's normally understood, it's the renaissance of classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. And Renaissance humanism is often seen as more to do with art than with humanism as we know it and we discuss it and understand it now. But, so you might ask why I'm talking about the Renaissance at all. Apart from, of course, the pleasure of looking at the paintings and the art and the architecture. Which certainly for me is a pleasure. The Renaissance, I think, is significant in the history of humanism. I'd certainly argue that, but because I think it shifted Christian Europe in a significant way into the influence or back to the influence of the classical world. I will be talking in broad terms. This is a big subject. There's a lot to cover, so I have to talk in broad terms, I think. But this is a broad progressive view that I'm expressing, I think, and it's one that is certainly disputed. One reason to talk about the Renaissance. Hello there. Hello there. Are you Naj by any chance? Najibullah?
Yeah, is my friend is Benny Amin?
Hello. Is Ben coming too?
Yeah, Ben is coming now. Yeah, maybe.
Okay. You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. I will carry on now. I was saying that I think one reason to talk about the Renaissance in terms of humanism is to make it clear and to justify my view that it is this significant step in history, or in the history of humanism. And another is to illustrate the particularly visual character of this Renaissance. I think it's very appropriate that we can have a visual talk to talk about such a visual revolution, you could call it as well. It's architecture, it's painting, it's sculpture. It's not just a physical or a political movement or expression of a change of attitude or a philosophy. Jacob Burckhardt is a German art historian. In 1860, he wrote a very influential book called The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. And in it, he outlined 3 ages in European history, which I've illustrated here on the screen. Here's the general picture of it, anyway. We have a classical age, a dark age, and the Renaissance. I presume you're all familiar with the CE and the BCE designation, the initials, Common Era and before the Common Era. It's a way of avoiding, I suppose, determining history in Christian terms, which would be the AD and the BC. So I'll be using the CE and the BCE. So we have the classical age, which is the age of Greece and Rome, up to about 450, which is roughly the fall of the Roman Empire. Then we have a period which Burckhardt calls the Dark Age, up to about 1300, when the Renaissance as we know it starts to kick off. This broader outline is certainly refuted by some historians. It is broad because it denigrates the Christian era from some historians' point of view. It sees obviously this whole dark age in the middle as dark compared to the lighter classical age and Renaissance. And also refuted by more modern historians, I think, revisionist historians. Post-structuralism, modern theory would see this as Eurocentric, possibly even as, or because it's Eurocentric, as some part of an imperialist ideology, categorizing human history in this way. But these are the broad terms I'm going to be dealing with. So this Dark Age is the period after the fall of the Roman Empire, as I said. Dark meaning unenlightened, meaning unrecorded. Means there's far less recording going on of the age itself. And it's also a period when it seems that classical knowledge and texts were lost, and the learning of the time was unrecorded, as I say, as itself, its own history was not recorded as well. It's also described as a European age of faith and of Christendom, the height of Christendom. So you can see perhaps why a Christian historian might not be so happy to have it denigrated even as a dark age. the claim sometimes of these historians, especially the Christian ones, is that there was actually a consistent knowledge of the classical world throughout this time, as I'll show you in a second. But I think it's still fair to think of it as a dark age, especially in comparison to the Renaissance, as we're going to talk about it in a minute. Here's one of those lifts or enlightened spots in the Dark Age, the Carolingian Renaissance. This is the era of Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire, when there was some collection and copying of classical texts, such as a copy of Vitruvius, the architect, which proved to be a very, very significant text later on in the Renaissance. But this kind of knowledge was very confined and limited, actually, to the clergy, to the monasteries, and to the narrow court of the Holy Roman Empire. It didn't spread, it didn't disseminate, it wasn't passed through the population, it wasn't a common form of knowledge, very specialized. It did have one thing which I think is a significant moment in this period, which is a kind of restructuring of the idea of education, borrowed a little bit from the classical era. There was a British cleric called Alcuin who did revive some of the ideas of the classical world, and we're going to be talking about the education system during the Renaissance, so I can talk more in detail about that. But there was some flowering of it at this point. But as I say, I don't think it had a long legacy. I think quite soon we moved on to another period where they were trying also to do the same thing in Northern Europe in the Ottonian Renaissance. These are Germanic kings. This is even more limited. I would be very surprised if any of you have heard of this era, this region, this little empire of the Ottonians. That shows you how little of a legacy there really is at this time in the 10th century. Perhaps more significant is the 12th century. This is called the Age of Scholasticism. It's a system of scholasticism is a system of theology and philosophy which is based on Aristotle, or Aristotle has worked into its Christian theology. But it's also very authoritarian. It's very much about tradition, about dogma, about following authority. There's even the term the ars dictaminis, which is a form of communication which happened between monasteries, clerics across Europe. Again, very limited, very formulaic in Latin. The first universities did begin at this time, so that's certainly a legacy which has lasted. You know, the universities of Bologna, Paris, Oxford, they began at this time. Not the first in the world. I'm still talking, of course, we're talking about European history, but certainly the first in Europe. But these universities, I think, even though they were taking up some of the classical ideas of education, the main aim of these universities was to teach theology. The others were preparatory stages in the final stage of a student's or a cleric's training, which was to be a theologian, to study theology. That was the highest, that was the master's degree, if you like. This period was also the beginning of Gothic architecture, so that's certainly a legacy that has lasted, something we recognize, we can admire. That happened at this time, and it was obviously spread throughout Europe. So there were things going on in this Dark Age, but my argument is that they are on a much lower level and a much more restricted level than the Renaissance that we know in general understanding, the thing that began sometime around 1300 CE. So what is this Renaissance that we know? 13 CE to 1600, very roughly again. These are very rough periods of time. You just have to put a date on it somewhere. Why is it more significant to humanism as well? Of course, that's the important thread of my argument today. Interestingly, I think the best evidence of why it's so significant is visual. So we're going to be looking at the visual evidence straight away to see why I think the previous eye spots were at a much lower level than the Renaissance eye, if you like. So we're going to have a kind of spot the difference immediately. If we take a look at these two images, the Wilton diptych on the right, on the left, excuse me. You can all see that, yes, on the left. From
Yes.
about 1400. This is a medieval style, and on the right, Vendramin family by Titian from about 140 years later, which is part of what's called the High Renaissance. I think there should be some very obvious differences straight away. If you look at this Wilton diptych, this is an English picture. It's a picture of Richard II, the English king, with his patron saints, John the Baptist, Saint Edward the Confessor, and another saint, I'm not sure who. Richard II there on his knees on the left, showing his devotion to the Virgin Mary and the Child on the right in their kind of pasture of paradise. They are flat images. They're on gold leaf. The figures are formulaic and flat. There's not much modeling. There's no shadow really. It's very flat, two-dimensional, and also formulaic. All the angels, for example, exactly the same figures. All the saints are roughly the same face. We can see, and then you see something like this by Titian. There's a world of difference, I think. This is three-dimensional figures that cast shadow. They're in a real space, surrounded by real air. They're moving in a naturalistic way in a real world. You can even see the candles on the altar blowing a little in the breeze. This is observation and technique, the ability and understanding of real natural space and the real natural world. The same with sculpture, physical objects. These two images are of the same genre, the Pietà, from exactly the same time. Pietà means pity in Italian. It's the genre of the dead Christ, the crucified Christ, on the lap, on the knee of his mother, the Virgin Mary. She's mourning the dead Christ. There's thousands of these images right through the medieval period and also right into the Renaissance, but you can see the obvious connection between the two of them, but there's a crude form to this Pietà. This is from Northern Europe. You see the figures are not realistic. It's not an observed piece, is it? It's not to scale. This is an enormous Virgin Mary and a tiny little crucified Christ on the lap of the Virgin Mary. Here, you can see it from several different angles here. This is Michelangelo's Pietà from exactly the same time. This is the High Renaissance, 1500 or 1499. You can see again it's three-dimensional. It's observed. It's a realistic human figures, almost alive. I think this you can see. I don't know if anyone's been to Rome, seen this in St. Peter's. It was actually attacked in the last century by some lunatic with a hammer. So they put it in a special niche that you have to pass in a long queue. You can see it just through a window, but you can see it from all dimensions. It's all realism. He does actually play, Michelangelo does play with forms. It is idealized. Actually, if you reconstructed the figures and had them stand up, the Virgin Mary would be about 8 feet tall. But he's playing with the idea of realism, how you view it, where you're standing when you view it. But it's a very large contrast to this image, I think you'd agree. So rebirth of what, as I said? What is this Renaissance a rebirth of? Humanism of Greece and Rome, of all of these aspects of that culture, of architecture, sculpture and painting, drama and poetry, philosophy, politics and forms of education too. In architecture, firstly, classical form is opposed to, or as opposed to Gothic. The Gothic of Europe, as we said, that came in the 12th century. Study of a text like Vitruvius's book De Architectura, on the styles and the forms, patterns of classical architecture, proved very important at this time in the Renaissance. And they actually began to put these templates into practice as well at this time, for the first time since the classical world. Also, archaeology was beginning to uncover things so that things could be studied firsthand. On the right, you can see the Forum in Rome, as it is now, but in the, I think in the, even up, right up to the 14th century, a lot of this was in pieces, partially underground. There wasn't much of it able to be seen until there was some digging began in the 15th century, some primitive archaeology, but a lot was discovered and a lot learned firsthand from looking at these, from looking at this architecture. Also, some sculpture was beginning to be uncovered too. Sculpture, classical sculpture was of such a high technical achievement of realism, plus this idealism, which I think I mentioned that Michelangelo picked up on as well. The sculpture on the left was dug up in the Forum, I believe, in Rome in about 1500. Hugely influential to artists who saw it for the first time, including Michelangelo when he was in Rome. If you know anything about Michelangelo's sculpture, you'd be able to see the influence, I'm sure. All of this was not, this style, this technical accomplishment was completely absent, I think, during the Dark Age. There certainly was sculpture, but it was mostly connected with cathedrals. You can see cathedral edifices and facades covered with sculpture, but it's all of a piece. It's all tending towards the divine, all of these kind of things. A different ethos to the classical world. Greek painting doesn't really survive, but Roman painting does to a certain extent. And if you look at these paintings, these Roman paintings, I think something leaps out at me when I see it straight away, is it's the realism. It's the realism you don't get in the medieval period, the Dark Age. It's the skill, I think, as well. The skill of observation. They look very modern as well to me, because they are observed directly. I think they look like they could exist now, like modern portraits. They also feel like real people, ordinary real people. They are not divine figures, supernatural figures. And real people, naturalism, observation of the natural world is something that was the ethos of the classical world that was being rediscovered, that the human being and the natural world, the human being was the measure of all things. This is an actual quote from a Greek philosopher, a pre-Socratic philosopher called Protagoras. He said, "Man is the measure of all things," which you could translate as the human being. Nowadays you would translate as the human being is the measure of all things. Also, Vitruvius, who I've mentioned twice already, in his book on architecture, talked about how design, architecture were built on human proportions. So man is almost literally the measure of all things. This famous drawing by Leonardo was his response to that, to reading Vitruvius and thinking and trying to illustrate, if you like, the idea of classical form based on the human form. So we have the square, the circle, also the triangle. These were very important in designing, building classical art and architecture. It shows that this is a human-centered philosophy. So I think you're able to get an idea of my argument. This is a revival of something human as opposed to something religious, theological. I think it's important to show there are also some historical processes coming in at this time which aided all of these other artistic discoveries. I think the Ottomans invading Constantinople and ending the Byzantine Empire in 1453 meant that Greek scholars at the time had to emigrate west, and they brought some of their texts with them. They brought their libraries with them to a certain extent and moved into Rome and to Paris, into Western Europe. And also these Byzantine scholars, these Greeks, also had a contact with the Islamic world. The Islamic world of the Abbasid Caliphate had preserved quite a lot of the Greek texts which had been lost in Europe. So some of these texts then came back into Europe via the Islamic world, via the Byzantine world, and then back into the West.
David?
Yes, carry on.
Are we finishing in 5 minutes?
No.
I thought we only had 40 minutes.
No, we've got no limit on the time.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, we'll carry straight through.
Because I'd like to make some comments.
Sure. I mean, you can comment along the way if you want to, or ask a question, or save it to the end.
Well, one thing I think people might like to know is that a historian called Bettany Hughes has aired some programs which are really fascinating. She's from the Open University, and the 3 programs, which I guess you could get on YouTube at any time. One is about Confucius, one about the Buddha, and one significantly to this talk about Socrates. And those 3 lectures on Open University are absolutely fascinating, at least so I found anyway. Yes,
yeah. She's talked quite a lot about the classical civilizations as well. She has another series on Sparta and on Athens.
Yeah.
In terms of the other influences coming in at this time, I think it's very significant that printing was invented in 1440 as well, at least in Europe. I think it was previously invented in China, but in Europe, it was a huge new dissemination of books and, of course, a new readership for those books. So the new knowledge was able to be spread much quicker and much further. There's also a political or a social change at the time. There's a move of the commercial classes in Western Europe, the rise of the merchant class, if you like, secular wealth, meaning that the church and the monarchy's hold on power was no longer exclusive. And this change was really happening first in the Italian city-states. And that's where we're going to go first. Next, if I can get it to change. Excuse me. Yes. We're talking about the Italian city-states where these changes started to happen first. And Petrarch was a very significant figure in Italy, called the father of humanism. He was a scholar, he was a poet, he was also training for the priesthood. He never took up his holy orders, but he was a trained priest, if you like. He was a cleric. In fact, many of the figures of the Renaissance were clerics. This is a mixed picture. I told you I'm talking in broad terms, of course, and there are some contradictions, but his main thrust of his life, his main vocation was as a traveller and a hunter of these classical texts. He saw this as his life's work. He built up an enormous connection right across Europe with the universities, with clerics, with royal houses. He wrote enormous amount of letters. He was a correspondent. He rediscovered an enormous amount of texts which had just been sitting, gathering dust, if you like, on the back shelves of monastic libraries, perhaps even of universities too. And he began to build up a picture of things which were lost. He began to see that all of this stuff was being wasted, being lost. He very significantly himself personally discovered a cache of letters by Cicero, the Roman orator, politician, writer, correspondent, which is one of those moments, I think, which had an enormous impetus, an enormous firing up of interest and influence in the Renaissance. Cicero is a very significant figure. He translated Cicero into vernacular Italian, again, making it more widespread, more able to be circulated, a wider readership. And crucially, I think Petrarch was the first to, he actually coined the phrase, I believe, Dark Age. He was the first to think of this division between the classical light age and the dark medieval age. There had been built up a picture of history by St. Augustine of 6 ages of human history, which are basically biblical ages. They're very much based on biblical events. Of course, you can guess that the 6th age is the age of the coming of the Messiah, Jesus. So he's refuting this. He's stepping into a new classification, a new kind of history, away from the ecclesiastical, religious, Christian map of history into something new, into something more like modern history, thinking of a dark age that he has been born after, if you like. Leonardo Bruni, generation or two later, I'm having to pick, there's an enormous number of figures I could talk about, and period and places and artifacts that I could talk about. I'm having to be very general. So I'll switch to a couple of generations later. Leonardo Bruni was a historian. He was also a translator of a great deal of Latin or Greek text into Latin, and some of those also into vernacular Italian. He was also a statesman. He was the Chancellor of Florence, so he had a lot of influence. He was a very prominent figure. He actually wrote a history of the Florentine people, and he compared Florence directly, made the direct comparison to Athens and to Rome. He saw it as a new Republic of Rome, or a new Athens or Pericles, a new classical age, if you like. He wrote, he carried on after picking up from Petrarch's idea of classifying history in this terms of light classical antiquity, moving into a dark age when things were lost. He actually did see himself as living in a new modern age, which is quite rare to be able to see for yourself. It's a kind of self-confidence in your human capacity to classify, to make history. That's why he's called the first modern historian, I think. He thought he was living in the new modern age, a better age too, as he said it himself. In this new age in 15th century Florence, the new merchant class. At the top of that class was the Medici family. They became enormously wealthy. They were bankers. They had Europe-wide connections. They joined very, very much this new spirit, which Bruni was talking about, this new age. And what they wanted to do was to express this new spirit by sponsoring a great deal of new building, new art, new literature. Very consciously, they did this. The first great project was the completion of this famous cathedral, the Duomo in Florence. It had been built over a period of 100 years in a modern-ish Italian Gothic style, but it had no dome. The space for the dome, the drum at the bottom, was so enormous that there was a technical problem in being able to build a dome. There was no, nobody had the knowledge or the skill to be able to even design something that could span that space to make this dome. There was a competition started, and the competition was won by Filippo Brunelleschi. He was, by training, a goldsmith. There's a lot of goldsmiths in Florence, but he had drawn inspiration from Rome. He'd been to Rome himself. He'd visited Rome. He'd also read Vitruvius. And he also, I think, he worked from this new belief in the human capacity and capability to create, to look at a real problem, not to rely on authority in the scholastic or the medieval model, but to actually work things out for himself using Vitruvius and the classical orders, the classical templates of building, of construction, so that he was thinking, excuse me, of something entirely different from the Gothic. As Kenneth Clark, the art historian, put it, the Gothic cathedrals were hymns to divine light, but Renaissance architecture celebrates the light of human intelligence. I think that encapsulates it very well. Brunelleschi encapsulates that very well. He was using his intelligence. He traveled to Rome with his friend Donatello, the sculptor, who I'm sure you've heard of. They studied these buildings, these new archaeological sites. Here we have on the left the famous Pantheon in Rome. The Pantheon is poured concrete, can you believe? It's the largest, it was then the largest concrete poured dome, span dome in the world, and believe it or not, it still is. Unreinforced, it's the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world to this day. Brunelleschi studied this. There's no evidence of how it was built. There's no record. Vitruvius died before this was built. He didn't write about it. Brunelleschi worked out that it would have probably cost hundreds and thousands, perhaps millions of trees to build the superstructure to pour this concrete on. So he had to come up with some cheaper, some environmentally less devastating method to build the Duomo, the dome on the cathedral. And he worked it out for himself. He created from scratch, if you like. He decided that it had to be built from masonry, and he needed to invent new techniques to create it. The cranes he invented himself are still in existence. I think you can still see them in Florence. Later architects actually still use them. He had to study natural forces. He had to study the natural world, how these things, he experimented, he built a smaller version. He worked out the stresses. He wasn't working from authority, he was working from natural law and observation. And this valuing of nature, of reality, which I think I've mentioned several times, this is a theme, a definite theme. It was also a theme in the classical world, and it can be seen, I think, in many forms in the Renaissance. The Renaissance humanist Alberti wrote that the artist should hold the mirror up to nature. In other words, learn from nature. I think we can see this. This is you all know this famous Last Supper, Leonardo's Last Supper. It's an example of this new study of natural law that may not be immediately apparent, but it does portray, doesn't it, a real naturalistic space. This is what you might have seen before in a portrait of the Last Supper, a medieval flat background. It would have been gold leaf at the back, etc., etc. You can see the table is flat, everything is flat. But Leonardo's version, you have a room behind the table stretching out behind the apostles, the disciples. But this is according to natural laws. We have the law of perspective, which was something being worked out at this time. The law of perspective was, especially by an art historian at the time called Alberti, worked this out in great detail. This law states that in human vision, parallel lines meet at the horizon at a vanishing point, which I can explain more clearly. If I draw the horizon there, the horizon is our eye level. So this is a situation in human vision. At our eye level is the horizon, and parallel lines will meet at that horizon at a vanishing point. This gives you a pattern on which to draw. You can see that Leonardo has used it to line up these alcoves on the left and right wall to make them realistic. It's realistic because that's how we see things in nature. It is a natural law, if you like. Here, it got so sophisticated, even in the early 15th century, that Paolo Uccello was able to produce something like this extraordinary three-dimensional drawing of a chalice, study of a chalice. That is actually so sophisticated, I think it looks like a modern computer-aided design image. It's fantastic. Also, this perspective of holding a mirror up to nature meant looking at nature, of course, studying nature. And it's the birth, really, I think, of natural observation, natural science. It's a combination of art and science. You can see Leonardo's study of the anatomy, the bones of the foot and the shoulder. He's working things out in a scientific way, but is also informing his idea of how to create images, paintings too. What's the body, what's the anatomy under the skin like? What's the body underneath the clothing like? On the right, we have Dürer with this unbelievable observation. You can see on the left of the clod of soil with the dandelions growing on it and the hair. Extraordinarily detailed, just for their own sake. These are not parts of other pictures. They're not for another purpose. They're just for the purpose of observation. So I think this naturalism is coming through very strongly. I think one very, very important reason for the lasting influence of the Renaissance was its education system as it was developing. Bruno called it the Studia Humanitatis, study of humanities, which was not just for clerics, as I say, but it was for a much larger proportion of the population, certainly of a city's population like Florence. And what we recognize today as faculties of humanities and science, I think, had their beginnings, their origins here at this time. So taking its lead from classical education, as it might have been, as it was described by Plato in the Republic, as also Cicero would have explained it in his writings too, of the idea of civic virtues. The aim of this modern Studia Humanitatis was the creation of civic virtue through education. This is very much a contrast to the medieval pattern of education. It's not a system of faith. It's not a system of rewards and punishments. It's not an education in those terms. It's something, the humanista, there was a newly coined word as well. That's a teacher of humanism, was called a humanist for the first time. Also written at this time were two classic texts on civic virtue. One of them you may not have heard of is Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. Became the quintessential portrait of what was become now known as the Renaissance man, the idea of the perfect civic, perfectly educated Renaissance human being. Another one is Machiavelli's book, which has come now to be seen as something of a dark book about political spin, but is actually a humanist text if you could ever get to read it. The medieval system put very much an emphasis on this block on the left, the quadrivium. That is what you were aiming for when you were an undergraduate, or what they called it as a Bachelor of Arts. The aim was to then move on to the Master of Arts, which was about theology. That was always the aim of the medieval system of education. In the Renaissance, they swapped this round completely. They saw, under the influence of people like Cicero and the classical world generally, that this trivium, and it was called trivium in the medieval times, that's where the word trivial comes from. It was seen as unimportant or less important. But these modern Renaissance humanists now saw this as the most important thing in education. And the ultimate aim of education was the creation of this civic Renaissance ideal: grammar, logic, rhetoric, moral philosophy, history, Greek, Latin. Theology was then, at this time, was separated off into religious seminaries. It was a separate course of study, as it still is today, I think, or it is also in universities today, but certainly separated off at this time from the education system. In Florence, the Medici patronage produced a Florentine academy on the model of Plato's academy, and it had an enormous influence. There was a guiding light at this academy, Marsilio Ficino, excuse me. He stated that this century, like a golden age, has restored to light the liberal arts, which were almost extinct: grammar, poetry, rhetoric, painting, sculpture, architecture, music. Another member of that group, Pico della Mirandola, wrote his book On the Dignity of Man. That expresses a lot, just the title of it, which is called The Manifesto of the Renaissance. Michelangelo was moving in this circle, formally and informally. He was taught by Ficino. He imbibed a lot of these ideas himself directly. Botticello, Leonardo, even Galileo later on was patronized by the Medici. He benefited a great deal. I think I'm going to conclude now just by saying, although I'm drawing a broad picture, of course I recognize there are overlaps in these eras. Somebody didn't just wake up one morning in 1300, open the window and say, oh, look, the Renaissance. Of course, it's much more subtle than that, but I'm drawing a broad picture. Classical texts were known throughout the Middle Ages, and they were incorporated into theology. You know, Aquinas knew about Aristotle. But much really was lost and ignored in the Middle Ages. And as Leon Alberti at the time, around 15 or 1480, around that time, would have said, I used to both marvel and to regret that so many excellent and divine arts and sciences, which we know from their work and from historical accounts, were possessed in great abundance by the talented men of antiquity, have now disappeared and are almost entirely lost. Similarly, the Renaissance was not, of course, a utopia, some serene humanist utopia. It was also an age of great conflict. Ficino, that teacher I mentioned, he believed as much actually in astrology as he did in the rationalism of Cicero. And the Medici themselves, being these great patrons, the patrons of some of the great art that people still flock to see today, the greatest art of Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo. they were also, of course, engaged in warfare, internecine wars, assassinations, along with all the other family city-states of Italy at the time. But I do think it was a significant era when people seem to look up from the rule books and notice with a sustained curiosity the real world and real human subjects in it. Okay, I'll finish there. I think I can see you all. Do you have any comments or anything anybody wanted to say?
Yeah.
Charles, yeah.
You couldn't mention everybody, but you might have mentioned Poggio Bracciolini, who rediscovered the text of Lucretius.
Yeah.
This is the De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, which it's a poem in 6 books, which I once had to read in Latin hexameters, and it presents the theory of Democritus and the atomic theory. And there's a very interesting book about it by Stephen Greenblatt, who's a Shakespearean scholar mainly.
Yes.
Lucretius could hardly have endeared himself to the church. So it's very surprising that the church allowed this to be printed and disseminated. Quite
Yes.
how they managed to square it with the Christian faith, I don't know, but it is surprising.
It's very critical of the divine, isn't it? And
yeah,
it's about the natural world in a sense.
yeah.
That's one of the conflicts at the time. I think there was all of these things going on at the same time. It's not possible to talk in black and white terms exactly. You can't talk about the church as the enemy suppressing these things, because these things were being incorporated to some extent. But a lot of these figures did get into trouble with the church, didn't they?
I think so, yeah.
Certainly Galileo later.
Galileo, yes.
Wow, as I'm sure we know, but some other figures too. I think Pico della Mirandola was in trouble too, and the Inquisition came into the later on in the century. But certainly there was conflict, and also there's this thing called syncretism, which the church tended to do. Syncretism in philosophy means incorporating previous or other theories into your own theory. So there's a lot of this, what I would think in modern terms of pretending that these things fitted together, that the philosophy of Aristotle fitted into some Christian pattern of theology or cosmology or something.
So it's a question of reconciling conflicting theories, isn't it?
Yes, yes. We might sometimes call it now a what would we call it? The division in the mind. What's that phrase?
It's a cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance. Yes. You partition off things which you pretend they fit together and they don't.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
But at the time, of course, this is a world pre-Darwin. I think it's very important to say that part of this progress, I think, of humanistic thought or rational thought, however you want to call it, moving into the Enlightenment. But then I think Darwin's theory of evolution is so fundamental in changing the ability of people to see that there can be natural explanations for these things. At the time in the Renaissance, of course, how could they possibly know about creation other than creation? They didn't have a model of it. How could they work things out for themselves? I would say to the new member, I didn't catch your name actually. Ben's friend, sorry, did you mention your name?
Yeah, my name is Jalal.
Jalal. Hello, Jalal.
Yeah.
I know we're not talking about specifically humanism today. It's not an instructional meeting or anything like that. There are places you can go to learn about humanism.
Okay.
Yeah, and I can pass them to you through Ben, or I'm sure he's come up with some things himself, ways of understanding humanism if you're interested.
Okay.
Yeah, we will have. Carry on. Yeah.
Yeah, he's called me. I come. Maybe it's like 10 minutes. I don't know why no can.
Okay, he's a little late. Yeah.
Yeah.
We won't be around for too much longer, but hopefully he can join us. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're very welcome. I mean, we'll have meetings as often as we can in these situations. Obviously, it's all on Zoom at the moment. And
yeah, thank you very much.
bit by bit, I guess we're learning about different aspects of humanism, and yeah.
Okay.
I think. Does anybody else have a comment on? Yeah, Julie.
This is, of course, Europe-centric, this concept.
Yes.
And I'm interested in painting, and the concept of perspective, which you pointed out, came in, and the more realistic kind of portraits. But I'm not quite sure how the timing of this compares with what was going on in China. But Chinese painting doesn't have perspective.
No.
In the classical Chinese painting, so they moved in a different direction, as it were.
Yeah, I'm making an assumption. I'm not an expert on whether it was originated in China. I think there is some precedent somewhere else. It may be in the Islamic world, but it certainly isn't in China, is it? China is very akin to medieval painting, actually, where you will have things are very stylized, set on top of each other. You can have the same character 3 times in the same picture. All of those kind of.
Yeah, and more important, characters are painted bigger.
Bigger, that's right. Yeah, I know. There's a lot of that in where you saw in the medieval painting. Sometimes you will have the Christ figure as enormous, and actually, right up into the late Renaissance, Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel, and the last work he did was on that altar wall, and he has, it's the what's it called when the Christ comes again? Help me out here, Charles.
The second coming, or the
second
ascension?
coming.
Oh, the second coming. Yeah.
Resurrection.
Not the resurrection, no. It's the end of days. You know, the
yeah.
But the Christ is enormous on that wall. He's this vast, muscular figure who's 3 times the size of all the other characters. But so I think perspective was really worked out thoroughly in a, you could say, a scientific way. I think that I showed you that picture by Uccello of that chalice. He was supposed to have been so obsessed with working out these things. He spent years trying to do these things, and he used to lose sleep and lose his friends, and he became a bit of an obsessive about it, but he was really working it out.
And it kind of links to the architecture as well, doesn't it? Because it's like 3-dimensional.
Yes.
I think they probably go together.
Yes. Also, the architecture thing, I could say that in classical architecture, you really were working things out in ideal forms, so that things were built in cubes. Things might look enormous from the facade of a classical building, but it's still also a cube, square. And the dome inside the Pantheon, if you were to project the dome downwards, if you can see my hands, it would be a perfect ball shape that lands on the floor. So the dome is perfectly fitting inside a cube. That's the kind of thing the classical world was working out, thinking of in those terms. And also, as Vitruvius pointed out, on human terms. So we still have sort of a legacy, don't we, of working out units of measurement on human terms, don't we? We talk about the foot, we talk about the span, the arm span, those kind of things. Classical architecture really was worked out on those terms as well. They would use those units, especially something like the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens is all of these units are worked out mathematically to build something which you wouldn't assume necessarily to the eyes is about cubes or anything like that, but actually is. Yeah. It's also, interestingly, because they are dealing with the real world, there's a famous thing about the Parthenon is that it looks like it's perfectly has perfect straight lines, but there are actually no real straight lines on the Parthenon. It's designed for the optical effects of the eye. As the image will appear in the eye, it is slightly bowed. It is slightly bowed on the ground. The columns are slightly wider in the middle, etc. So
right.
it appears to be straight and
There's a technical term for that, is entasis.
Entasis, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a Greek word meaning what you just described.
Yeah. So it looks straight, doesn't it? It appears to be straight to the human eye, but actually it's worked out. So they're not in Gothic, in medieval architecture. They're always thinking of divine plans. You have, it's about light, where the light falls on in the church. But also interestingly, I think, you know, we're talking about this isn't black and white. The church, the Christian church, was an entire continuation, architecturally speaking, of the Roman basilica. Roman basilica was a long oblong building called a nave. Nave in the center, and at the end would be the apse, the curved shape at the end of the basilica. This was a town hall, basically. The Roman basilica was a town hall. This was adapted to the Christian church, who just took it wholesale and just added the cross to signify the crucifixion of Christ. But it's basically a basilica. So these things were continuing in some form or other right through the Dark Age. It's not a black and white picture, but I do think it is. Renaissance is still significant. The art historian I mentioned somewhere along there, Kenneth Clark, who I'm sure you've heard of, maybe you know about his TV series. He said at the beginning of one of his programs on the Renaissance, he said, I'm sorry, I wish I could say something original about the Renaissance, but when you look at it, it really was a change. It really was something new happening. It really was a rebirth. I mean, I know he's a he's a conservative, you might say, historian, but at least on those terms, I agree with him. I think it is significant. For humanism too, of course, this isn't an art history club. This is a humanist group. I think it's significant for humanist thought too. Anything else? Does that lead anybody? Did anybody want to talk about anything else as well this month? We haven't met for a month, have we? Any information from outside? I think the Humanist UK annual general meeting will go ahead, I think, online. I can't remember the date exactly. There'll be something going on. There's also a Humanist International meeting going on online. You may have been informed of those, or you might be on mailing lists for those and newsletters. But I can pass those on if you're interested. Okay. Does anybody have a request for a subject? Something we can talk about for our next meeting?
Have to think about that, I think.
Trying to see if we're 9. Okay.
Well, I should think about that one, David, and email you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, we should be waking in the middle of the night for inspiration.
We're still in the phase of not really knowing, who can make too many plans for the future. We'll have an August meeting. Normally in August we'd be on our social events, wouldn't we? We'd be having pub lunch and possibly lunches elsewhere. So we wouldn't normally be meeting anyway, but our normal program would kick off again in September. Who knows? Who knows what's happening in September? But for the moment, we're here, aren't we? And the meetings are free. We don't have to pay for any accommodation. We don't have to pay for the roof over our head. So, okay.
Did you cancel the bookings for the meeting room?
Yeah. So we didn't book it for July and August anyway, did we? So
no, that's true.
So we will only be. I'll cancel for September unless we can meet again in person. But at the moment, it doesn't look like it, does it?
No.
Okay, I think we'll wind up today.
Okay.
Thank you, David. That was very interesting.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, David.
Nice to meet you.
Was it Jalal, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Hope to see you again.
Nice to meet you. See you again. Maybe
Okay.
next week?
It won't be next week, maybe in 3 weeks or something, because I'll have to come up with a subject or a speaker.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'll let you know through Ben, yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
See you
Bye,
again next
David.
time.
Goodbye.
Bye.